This podcast is brought to you by the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania.
Risk management will be an important component for many businesses as they reopen in the months ahead. They still must consider the potential risks to employees as we deal with the coronavirus, like how much capacity in the office should be. Firms must also think about the working environment to make sure it's safe, including maybe keeping elements of PPE, things like hand sanitizer, on as a longer-term option. Chloe Demrovsky is CEO of the Disaster Recovery Institute International. They're taking a look at what is ahead, and a pleasure to have her joining us for a few moments today. Chloe, thanks very much for your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Dan. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. So when you look at this, larger scale, what do you think are the top risks that companies really should be focusing on right now?
Well, one that everyone's talking about to each other, and I know that there's a lot of conversations going on between risk managers and senior leaders saying, what is our liability? What are you concerned about? What are you doing? They want to get back to the office, especially some senior managers really want to get back into the office and want to see people there because of the cost to corporate culture and productivity and all of these things. But at the same time, they're concerned. They're more willing to go in themselves than to say compel people who work for them to go back in.
So I think you mentioned risk management. I think that's a term with which a lot of companies maybe didn't really have in their vernacular up until this pandemic, maybe to a degree. But certainly I think the mindset of a lot of companies around the term risk management has really changed in the last year.
It definitely has. I would say, unfortunately, we've been quite popular. So risk management was always kind of considered as an after effect and was very rarely included in strategy conversations and very rarely to the board level, except in maybe some highly regulated sectors like financial services, where they might bring risk management and business continuity to the table for briefings, at least periodically. And those concerns were usually tied up in technology, cybersecurity, cyber resilience. And then boom, out of nowhere, a pandemic happened, and even though it shouldn't have been out of nowhere if they had been including risk management in more regular conversations. And suddenly, it was really at the fore of everybody's mind, and risk managers were being brought in to really figure out how to manage organizations at every possible level and all around the world.
Well, and it sounds like part of the discussion is the old short-term versus long-term question that comes up to play quite often. Obviously, I think a lot of companies are dealing with this in the short term of dealing with employees being at home and thinking about them, coming back to the office at some point here in 2021. But you also have to think about this longer term, because a lot of people have talked about the fact that, this may not be the last pandemic that we're dealing with.
Right. And there is a danger, of course, of always fighting the last war, looking at the last crisis and over-preparing for what just happened, when in all likelihood, the next crisis is likely to be something completely different. We survey risk professionals every year about what's worrying them, what's of concern to their organizations in particular. And, in 2019 pandemic, it was on the list, but it was number 13. Right. Of course, in 2020, it then became the very top issue, beating out the normal concerns of, technology risk and natural disasters and terrorism and all of those kinds of issues. Loss of intellectual property is always a big one these days. And so it's important for any resilience program to remain flexible, and exactly that. We're testing and exercising our ability as an organization to respond to unforeseen events nimbly, to change appropriately, and to make sure that we have the right team there, the right players at the table, and that there's enough people within the different layers of the organization who are involved in this process regularly, that you're not reliant on one or two people who maybe don't have a lot of clout within the organization, or even if they're the most senior leaders, maybe it's an issue with succession planning, or maybe, a sudden death, unfortunately, of senior management. So you really do need to have this as a part of your culture. And I think we're going to see a lot of employees demanding that as a result of the pandemic. And we're seeing boards certainly start to do more due diligence in terms of requiring it as well.
Is it safe to say that kind of the unknown in many cases around the pandemic is certainly having an impact on what may very well be the unknown of the company moving forward in terms of, making that call of bringing employees back or keeping them home and some of these other dynamics that have been at play the last year?
Yeah, well, very few organizations are really wanting to go first, especially if they are more office environments where they haven't had to have a lot of essential workers or frontline workers out there. And a lot of this is around whether or not to require vaccinations, whether they can compel employees to be vaccinated in order to come into the office or to travel on behalf of the company, for example. And so a survey by Gartner saw that a majority of organizations are going to try to encourage vaccinations strongly rather than requiring it outright. Those that are actually doing vaccination programs on site and are requiring it are really those that have had frontline essential workers throughout this process. So I think they're a little bit of a different work environment where those workers are probably quite relieved to have access to a vaccine because they've been at risk all along. So United and American Airlines, for example, pharmaceutical company AbbVie, energy giant ExxonMobil, Tyson Foods, Smithfield Foods, which is a meat packer. These are the kinds of companies that are really bringing in on-site vaccination programs. But then there are other types of organizations, similar organizations that are, again, encouraging rather than requiring, like Trader Joe's or Instacart, again, a lot of frontline workers. And then Dollar General is doing something really cool, creative, which is, offering some incentive pay around for employees to go and get vaccinated outside of work hours. So everyone's kind of taking a different approach. But, a lot of companies are concerned about compliance issues, liability issues. They could face problems in terms of workman's comp or Americans with Disabilities Act. So there's a lot of challenges in terms of collecting healthcare information. Privacy is, of course, another consideration as well when you're looking at really collecting sensitive information about your employees' health. But if they don't do it and they have people come back to the office and then there's talk about, well, I'm not vaccinated, do you have other employees push back and say, well, I don't want to go to lunch with that person, I don't want to travel with that person, I don't want to be at a meeting with that person? So the truth is nobody really knows exactly what the right approach is, and everyone seems to be kind of having conversations across organizations to figure out exactly what the right level is.
Well, and then on top of that, now you have the fact that states are starting to remove mask mandates at some point, and to a degree, some of those states doing that are kind of putting it back on the local government, the county government, and to a degree, I think sometimes the companies themselves as to how they really want to approach it. The state may be stepping back just a touch, but now it really does more so fall on the individual, on the company to really take this forward.
Yeah, and that can have issues with in terms of compliance by employees with the rules. Obviously, this has gotten highly politicized. And that, by the way, if you look at the history of pandemics, it's not uncommon. It's not like this is the first time we've ever had divisions over public health measures versus freedom. The Spanish flu, we had a lot of those as well in this country and around the world. It's just part and parcel of a pandemic or a major public health situation. And again, it's something that should be prepared for. I think the key, when possible, is for public health measures to be as consistent and predictable as possible without a lot of kind of change or differences, especially if an organization has offices in lots of different areas. They'd probably want to go with whatever is the most strict across all of their offices so that they have something more uniform. But it makes it a lot more challenging when we have a lot of mixed messages going on and a lot of changes. Some of that is inevitable because it's a new disease, it's a new strain, it's a new this, and so we're learning a lot about it as we go. So some change is inevitable, but it's helpful where possible to have a really consistent approach.
So how much then are you hearing from companies that while they have to set the policy and they have to kind of set the framework for what's going to happen moving forward, that a lot of this still does have to be conversations with employees, especially considering they are the ones that, potentially could be impacted by a lot of this, over the course of going back to the office?
Well, Dan, it's been a fraught time in general, I think, for workplaces and the discussion of hot political issues. And the pandemic is, of course, one of those. We've had lots of others in the past year. Again, having social issues become, a knock-on effect of a pandemic is also something that was highly predictable. And it's creating a lot of challenges for organizations to kind of figure out what the right tone is and what the right level set is. And on the one hand, while technology has really enabled us to to continue to work really remarkably at remarkably productive levels and to stay connected to our teams and to each other in a way that is amazing, frankly. It also has challenges because it's harder to read a room. It's harder to figure out, how your employees actually feel about a certain kind of conversation and what they really think. People might be less willing to kind of share on a group Zoom call than they might be in a meeting, whether it's one-on-one or in person. And those challenges are just going to get even worse when we're in a hybrid environment where some employees are in person and some are remote. I've been managing hybrid teams my whole career, and it has a whole unique set of challenges that are complicated, and every manager is going to have to learn those moving forward. As we see that, some employees are probably very likely going to say, you know what, because of my health risk, I really can't come into the office until maybe 2022. And companies are going to have to be flexible in their approach.
That's a very important point, because a lot of firms have to take that health element into account. And I know there's a lot of conversation about what the rules are going to be about being back in the office or requiring people to be back in the office, especially if they don't have a direct health risk in this as we move forward.
Yeah, and there's also going to be the question of fairness. I mean, inevitably, when some people are in the office and some people are remote, you're going to create new dynamics in terms of, who gets attention, who gets face time with the boss, or maybe the boss is never there. And so, the team is constantly talking about the boss, or there's all kinds of new dynamics that can spring up, different kinds of team dynamics within organizations. There is something really powerful, and it seems obvious and it seems funny, but being in one office together and seeing your colleagues working reminds you that everyone's kind of pulling their weight. Even if you don't see the results of their work every day, that they're working. When you have people who are distributed and you don't see people working and you don't necessarily see their results because you're not sitting at the top and you don't see the full picture, sometimes resentments build up, the kind of petty office politics sort of thing really start to kick in. And so it's really important to focus on reminding people that we're a team and doing some extra team building around that as well, because otherwise you're just going to have this very strange environment. And especially if people are staying home because of a health risk, that's when you really get into some potentially really sticky issues.
Chloe, thanks very much for your time and your insight. All the best.
It's been a pleasure, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you. Chloe Demrovsky, CEO of the Disaster Recovery Institute International.
To keep engaged with Wharton Business Daily and other Wharton School shows, visit businessradio.wharton.upenn.edu.